Welcome to Daniel Kahneman, professor at Princeton University at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs and the Department of Psychology, winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics. Welcome to UCLA, Danny.
Thank you.
Let's start way back. I'm curious what careers you had envisioned for yourself early on.
What do you mean by early on? How early do you want me to go?
As early as you like. What else could you have imagined yourself becoming when you look back?
I mean, I think I always knew I was going to be a professor from a very early age. I mean, it seemed to be the consensus that I was going to be one. I suppose because I was talking in long words as a child. I think the only question I had as I grew up was what I'd be a professor in. I mean, it was always fairly clear that I was going to end up at a university. I always thought I would. And then I actually went to professional guidance and, to a vocational thing. And they told me psychology was clearly the best and economics was a second possibility, and that the dreams I'd had of being a physicist were just dreams. So that's.
What attracted you to the study of psychology?
Mainly philosophical problems. I mean, as a teenager, I was interested in all the standard philosophical questions that occupy teenagers, like why should we be good? Why should we not sin? Why is life the way it is? And I found, as a teenager, I found that I was actually more interested in my own thought processes and in the thought processes of others as I was dealing with these problems than I was with the problem themselves. So I'm more interested, and I was as a teenager, in indignation than in ethics, in a broad sense. That is, what is it that makes people, angry at other people for certain actions? And similar things, I think, with respect even to metaphysics. Mm. So clearly, I came to psychology as a way to do philosophy. Mm-hmm.
And when you were in the Israeli military, at one point, you were designing assessment tests.
Indeed.
How did that affect your subsequent research and your interests?
Well, that had a huge effect on my research life. After a year in the infantry, I was attached to the psychological unit of the Israeli Defense Forces, and this was a period where it's very early in the history of of Israel. This was 1955, so the state and the army are 7 years old, and I was with a BA in psychology, which I had. I was professionally the best trained person in the Israeli army to do those kinds of things. So I participated in assessments of officer candidates, and that was very influential in my development. And I was also asked to set up an interviewing system for combat, units, which, by the way, is still in force. I mean, I'm very proud of that because it's been 50 years and they still do exactly the same thing. Now, in the process of doing that, what I encountered was the deficiencies of clinical judgment. And I encountered them personally, just looking at myself. The fact that I would interview people and I was very highly confident that I could get to their character. But then it would turn out, the statistics would show that with those interviews, we're incapable of predicting the real criteria that we thought we could predict. So that was, I actually coined the expression, the illusion of validity, that you must be familiar with. I invented that expression as a 22-year-old, I mean, in the context of those experiences. I did my military stuff. I just graduated. I was an undergraduate. Then I got my degree at Berkeley, and at Berkeley I was kind of very eclectic, so I did all sorts of things. My thesis was on the semantic differential, doing things to which I've been returning in the last few years, actually, scaling, affectively loaded things, which is what I'm interested in these years. And also I was interested in vision, so I did a lot of work with a teacher that I respected, Tom Cornsweet, on optical benches and kind of hard-nosed vision research. And when I came to Israel, the lab that I established was a vision research lab. And I was quite deliberate about that. I thought I wasn't professional, that I hadn't been properly professionally trained, and that I needed to get grounding in just publishing basic research types of things. And I remember thinking that before I ever aspired to be a chef, I had to be a short order cook. I mean, that really was a guiding thought, and to be able to set a problem, solve it, write it up in a clean way. And I viewed myself as being in training for a number of years as a young, PhD.
How did you meet Amos Tversky, and what were your first impressions of him?
Well, I met Amos the first time. I didn't actually meet him, I saw him. But it made an impression on me, so I remember that. Amos was an officer in the paratroopers in Israel, and there always was a kind of mystique to the paratroopers. And people with a sort of the red beret was, you looked at them. And Amos, well, I have to tell you a bit about the history of the psychology department in Jerusalem. There was a department before the War of Independence in '48, and then the professor got killed, and for several years there was something, really very rickety, and I got my BA in that rickety part, and they closed the department altogether, and they reopened it in 1957. And they had the first class, and they had an entrance examination for the first class. They had a first class of 20 people, and I had graduated by then, and I was out of the army by then, and I participated in constructing that test. And I saw Amos as he came. He got leave from the paratroops to participate in that. And I was struck by that young man because he looked very pale. It turned out he had been wounded, and so I was very struck by it. And it turned out, which I didn't know until later, that I think he was one of the stars of that particular test. That was an extraordinary group, by the way. Amos is the best known of that group, but 19 of the 20 people got PhDs. And you would probably know the names of several of the people. I mean, Manny Donchin, who was chair of Illinois for many years, and Amnon Rappaport, whom you know, they were classmates of Amos's. It was an absolutely extraordinary group. So that was the first meeting. Then I met him in Michigan when I was a postdoc and he was a graduate student. And then I met him in Israel when I had joined the faculty. Let's see. When I came back from my postdoc, he was already there.
How did you start collaborating?
That's quite a story. I was running a seminar at the time called Applying Psychology, which was, I wanted to distinguish that from applied psychology. The idea was applying the general principles of psychology to the everyday world. Again, you would know quite a few of the names of the people who took that seminar, like Tzor Shapira and Bar Fischoff. They were both in it. And Amos had come back from Michigan, and he was expert on decision making and judgment under uncertainty. And so I made an exception to my usual rule of, that we're discussing applied problems, and I brought him to tell us, because I knew nothing about the topic, what was new in that field of application. And he came, and he described Ward Edwards' research paradigm, the book back in poker chips paradigm. And I gave him a very hard time.
Why?
Oh, because it looked completely unbelievable to me. My field at the time was mostly perception. So the idea that people were conservative Bayesians just didn't make any sense, really. And as from the perspective of somebody in perception, you just there wasn't a process model. I mean, there was no explanation of how where did the errors come from, where did the performance come from. It was kind of an artificial generalization, and we had quite a conversation where I was attacking, I suppose, the Bayesian model. And now it turns out there's something that I didn't know until last year. One of Amos's close friends is now quite a famous philosopher, Avishai Margalit. You might have read things by. He tells the story that he met Amos that day, and that Amos told him that his faith in the Bayesian paradigm had been shaken. That's something I didn't know. But I do know that Amos and I agreed to have lunch and discuss, what was clearly kind of exciting. And we had lunch, and I think over lunch we had the ideas of representativeness and availability. And but we were still not committed to much of anything. Then I had been teaching statistics, and I was full of stories of sort of incorrect statistical intuitions, including my own. I mean, not. And I was going to England that summer to work on attention in Cambridge. While in Cambridge, I made up a questionnaire, which turned out to be the questionnaire of the law of small numbers. And we had arranged that Amos would come and visit me, and we spent some delightful days together in Cambridge discussing that thing. And from there, he went to the mathematical psychology group, and he administered the questionnaire there and at the APA meeting to real experts. He had several people who had written textbooks in statistics, and just every single hypothesis that we'd had came through. And then he came back, but neither of us was attaching a great deal of importance to what had been done. And we got together to write that thing. And that was an absolutely magical experience. I mean, we really clicked, and it was very funny. I mean, the whole thing was funny. It was an ironic piece, and Amos was just extraordinarily witty. And it turns out that when I was with him at that time, I was quite funny as well. And so we would just laugh all day long. And that was the most joyous work experience I've ever had. And that really got us started.
When you started collaborating, what were your goals? What did you hope to achieve together?
We didn't have, we were putting one foot in front of the other. We didn't have big goals. We thought that's a fun paper to write. And then we had lots of ideas about other things to do.
You observed in your...
We were not, let me add something. We were not, I think, the first ones to know that what we were doing was important. The first person I know who saw it, and he didn't tell me, he told Amos, who told me, and I remember being very surprised. That was David Krantz. Mm-hmm. And David said, what you're doing is sort of a revolution in the way that people think about probability. And I remember my sense, what on earth is he talking about? Because it really didn't feel like anything revolutionary was happening. It was just kind of applying common sense and basic psychological notions to a field, where there was very little that had been done in some sense. I became very attached to the work when we were doing the psychology of prediction. And we went to, Amos was, close friends with Paul Slovic, who was in Eugene, Oregon. And actually, Amos and I started working in '69 together. And in '70, he went to Was it 70 or 71? I could easily get confused here. Maybe he went in 71. 72, he was at the Center for Advanced Studies. And I did a lot of research that year where we were corresponding by mail, but I did a lot of the research of the stuff that went into representativeness and availability. Then he arranged for me to join him in Eugene. And that was the year that things really happened. And that was the year where it was obvious we were onto something, and and people were treating us with respect, and and the first time I really felt we were doing something quite important with the psychology of prediction, which we wrote in Eugene.
Mm-hmm. You observed recently in one of your American Psychologist articles that I think it was 6 out of your collective 8 most impactful papers you published together.
Oh, yes.
And I'm wondering, why do you think that the collaboration was so magical? And why was it so successful? What unique strengths do you think each of you brought to the collaboration, and where do you think the synergies came from?
We were spending our lives together. Most of the working day, every day. We could finish each other's sentences, and we frequently did. It's not, but we also kept surprising each other. And the magic that developed was, I've always thought that what was happening was that we were quicker in understanding each other than in understanding ourselves. The way that the creative process works, and I think that's true for most people, is that you first say something. And later, sometimes years later, you understand what you said. And in our case, this was just always it was foreshortened, and that was the magic. So I would say something, and Amos would understand it and elaborate on it, or he would say something, and it gives me goosebumps when I remember that. It was really quite extraordinary. So that was then we had, we brought stuff. We brought a lot of baggage with us. Amos, he just had impeccable taste. He knew what the problems were. He knew how to situate himself and the ideas we had in the broad field. I didn't have that. So that was clearly something that he contributed. I had lots of ideas, just an endless, and I had a lot of experience, of life experience. I think I was more of an observer of life than Amos was. Amos became a very keen observer of life. We also taught each other in enormous amounts. So we changed in the context of interacting. We changed while remaining, quite distinct personalities. But I think, Amos learned a few things from me. I learned a few things from him. But we just had that. What we had was that we trusted each other so much that when one of us would say something that was off the wall, the other one would search for the virtue in it. And you've been with Amos. That wasn't his style normally. I mean, his style is you would say something, he would shoot you down. But so I'm sure you've been on that side of. But between us, it was different. And when it was different, it was magical. When we turned critical on each other, we accomplished nothing. Basically.
So what have you learned in general, about the collaboration process from that experience? Maybe you just said it.
I don't think that there are very general rules. I mean, in our case, we just liked each other's style and we clicked very well. And we were very equal. I mean, there was absolutely no rank between us. All my other collaborations tended to be with people who are more junior, and they've been wonderful but different.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe the basic insights that led later on to the development of prospect theory?
Sure. We knew about the discontinuities of probability, so that was obvious. The insight there might have been to call it decision weights, but that came later. And the big insight on the value function came out of my naivete. I mean, it's not, and that I still remember. I didn't know anything about decision making, so Amos sent me to read the book that he had co-authored with Robin Dawes and Clyde Coombs, and I read the chapter on utility. Yeah. And I read the chapter on utility theory, and I came back not with an aggressive question, but completely puzzled, saying something really weird. I mean, all the gambles are described as gains and losses, and the utility functions are on wealth. Now, how did that translate? That's it, really.
How would you, when you describe prospect theory to an uninitiated audience, how do you describe it?
Well, I mean, it's really the fundamental idea, the key idea, I think, is that when people think about consequences, they have a particular way of representing the consequences, and that way is in terms of changes, so gains and losses. They think of the transition. That turns out to be a disaster in many ways because the transition is not predictive of what's going to happen later. But that's the way that people represent it. And then associated with that is an asymmetry in the treatment of different kinds of consequences, such that people put more weight on losses than on gains. Those are the two key ideas, everything else. Most of the rest is kind of either obvious or technical, and a lot of the rest is wrong. But that, I think, is true and important.
So the paper was, in an important move, you sent it to Econometrica, probably the leading journal in economics. Why did you decide to send it there, and did you get a lot of grief from the editorial process? Was it difficult to get it published there?
I mean, that was another thing that Amos was very good at. He had a sense of the profession. And he was a decision theorist, which I never was, and indeed, in some sense, never became. I mean, he had much more of a taste for the formalism than I did, and we like different kinds of elegance. I mean, I was more into experimental elegance, and he was into formal elegance, which, by the way, was one of our joint strengths. And something that where we had an effect on each other. But Econometrica just was the best journal, and we sent it because we thought we had a good paper, and we had no grief at all. I mean, I don't even remember whether it was a revise or resubmit, but I mean, we certainly revised. But
do you think you got lucky?
No, it was a very good paper.
And yet there was, at least initially, a great deal of resistance from the economics profession.
Well, not to prospect theory. I mean, there was resistance to the broad idea that one could question the assumptions of the rational agent model. And that really didn't start with prospect theory. That started with the judgment work. I've recently looked at that literature, actually. I looked, which is something I never do, but I went and I looked at the early citations of the 1974 paper in Science. And among the very early citations, there is a paper by Peter Diamond. Mm-hmm. And, so clearly he saw that this was relevant, and other people saw that it was relevant and got agitated about it.
Do you think that if you and Amos hadn't discovered these judgmental heuristics and hadn't discovered some of the key principles underlying prospect theory, that somebody else would have? Do you think these are essential truths waiting to be discovered? Or do you think that there's something unique to the way in which you packaged it?
I don't, I think it's easy to do counterfactuals on this. I'll give you an example because it's one that occurred to me later. So we started out with representativeness and availability as heuristics. But here is a heuristic that I think nobody has explored but that occurred to me years later. It's the surprise heuristic. So you're trying to establish the probability of something. And so you ask yourself, how surprised would I be if it occurred? Which I'm convinced people do, and they do it quite a lot. Now this never got labeled as a heuristic. Mm-hmm. And, so somebody would have started from there. They would have had, it would have looked completely different. So I think it's quite arbitrary that representativeness and availability became the heuristics. That's an accident. There's nothing, intrinsically magical about these two. Loss aversion, somebody had to discover loss aversion.
Mm-hmm. Now, about 10 years ago, Princeton poached you from the University of California, and you received this joint appointment in the School of Public Affairs and the Psychology Department. How has your appointment in a public policy school influenced your teaching and your research?
Well, I've been teaching psychology and policy, so it's had an obvious effect in that way. I don't think it's had any particular effect on my research. It's a side interest, but I had that interest in policy. That's why I was very keen to be at the Woodrow Wilson School. I'd always been very interested in applied work, so that's not...
What do you think the impact of behavioral decision-making and behavioral economics has been to date? How would you characterize it on policymakers?
Well, at the moment, negligible. Just not much. But it's very early. I think the biggest thing that's happened in behavioral economics in terms of application is clearly save more tomorrow. It's around savings. Around savings and the whole notion of defaults and the new conception of libertarian paternalism. So I think the application of behavioral economics to policy is just beginning.
Have you been speaking with policymakers? Have you gotten their ear?
No, I don't. I've talked, but no, I haven't had their ear.
Are you disappointed that the field hasn't had more impact to date on that audience?
No. There is one message that I discovered recently that I'm going to tell you about, where I am disappointed, and it's something that I would like to do. And it has to do with strategy and with strategic decision-making. And in 1973, to put that in context, when we were in Jerusalem still, and just before the Yom Kippur War, I gave a talk in which there was a whole day on the social science and the strategic situation of Israel, and I gave a talk on mistakes. And it's at a place in Jerusalem, that's a beautiful place where Amos and I spent a lot of time, called the Van Leer Institute. And this year, 30 years later, I got invited to give the Oscar Van Leer lecture in Jerusalem, and I did. And I had found a transcript of my lectures of 30 years before, and I updated it. And that's what I did. And I found a list of biases in people's judgments and decision-making. Not our work. Well, a lot of it is in social psychology, negotiations, but, some of it is our work. And I was absolutely struck by the fact that all of these biases favor hawks over doves in strategic conversations. I had not realized that before. And that, I think, if I were younger...
Example?
Sure. Well, a familiar example is in negotiations. So you have loss aversion in negotiations, making things more difficult. Another example is in contingent certainty. So you can see that, in the debate about Iraq. I mean, it sounds like a compelling argument that if there was a possibility that you might be attacked, then you had to do something about it. And that, sounds compelling. You don't multiply risk by probabilities. And so there is a long list of those. I'll give you an example, that's the example I had in 1973, which is you're debating whether to give up strategic territory, obviously a problem for Israel. Now you know that if there is a war, the probability of you losing that war will be raised by your giving up the territory. Now, giving up the territory, on the other hand, may reduce the probability that there'll be a war. But it only may reduce it, whereas you're sure that you're better off with the strategic assets if there is a war. The second argument trumps the first, and that's a hawkish argument. So the entire list is hawkish. That, if I could get that message out and get people to listen to it and so on, that would be worth doing. But I'm not optimistic.
Well, people certainly have been listening to the message, and obviously the watershed moment was when you were awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. So what was your response, learning the news, and what surprises you about the ways that your life has changed since?
Well, it's obviously a joyous occasion. It's kind of a mixed bag because Amos wasn't there to get it with me, so, and in some sense, I think, well, there have been two things that I've been struck by. And the first one is that the source of pleasure and joy is entirely in the pleasure of others, which I had not realized. And that I realized the very first morning, and it was with me, during the period. I no longer think about it much, frankly, but during the first period, it was very salient. There was a press conference organized at Princeton, in the hall in which I teach, and there were lots of people, lots of colleagues and students, and they were beaming ear to ear, and that was a wonderful experience. I mean, just seeing people, so something good has happened to you, and people are enjoying it. And not only are they enjoying it, they're enjoying the fact that they're enjoying it, because it's a very pure experience to enjoy somebody else's pleasure. And so people feel good about you and about themselves. I mean, there's kind of a warmth to that, to that widespread pleasure. That clearly was the peak of my experiences in that domain.
What gives you special satisfaction and pleasure today in your career and in your life?
Well, I'm lucky. I'm still working. I don't think much about my life. I'm very much a day-to-day person. I don't have long-term plans, and I never really did either. And I'm not thinking in terms of my life as a as a monument of any kind. So on the day-to-day basis, I'm having a good time.
So are there any events that you would undo in your life? Anything that you would change?
Oh, many, but I'm not going to go into that.
Fair enough. Well, how about looking forward? What do you think the enduring lessons of behavioral economics will be?
I have, I have no idea. Something is happening, and the important thing that is happening is that very good graduate students are being attracted to that field. Now, what they're going to do, who could tell? If their professors knew now what their graduate students are going to be doing later that's going to change the field, the professors would be doing it now. They don't know. So I have no idea where it's going to go.
No idea what the field will look like 30 years from now?
No.
You recently got involved in some work in neuroeconomics. You published a paper with Hans Breiter and some other colleagues doing neuroimaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain while people were being exposed to different gambles. What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of this approach, and where do you think it's headed?
I'm enthusiastic, and I've been enthusiastic for a while, and I now think I wasn't enthusiastic enough. I was a bit skeptical, when the notion of neuroeconomics started out. I thought, oh, gee, that's premature. No, it doesn't seem to be premature. I mean, truly exciting things are happening. And it's going to change, I think it's going to change social science in some pretty profound ways. And it's going to have an impact on economics, because a lot of the resistance of economists to psychology is going to be bypassed once things are placed in the brain. And I'm finding that in my own research on well-being, that I'm just waiting for good physiological measures, and the good physiological measures and measures that can be related to immune function and to health, economists are going to take that seriously in a way that they won't take subjective answers seriously. So the potential for that is huge.
What questions do you find most interesting right now? What sort of goals do you have on the research front?
Well, I'm trying to understand well-being. It's a big enough problem to occupy me for the rest of my days, and so that's what I'm on to these days.
How has the study of well-being and decision-making influenced the kinds of decisions you make in your own life?
Some, not a lot, but yeah, some. I think that I have a perspective on what really matters to me that occasionally guides my choices. Not all the time, but occasionally some choices are guided by a broad view of what matters to me, and that was encouraged by the research. The one example that I remember where I really took action, it was guided by research, was buying furniture in the immediate context of buying a house. And that is very good advice. Don't wait until you start feeling poor before you start buying furniture. Buy the furniture, lump it together in one mental account. That was a fresh insight, when we bought a house in the late 70s, and that we applied that one, and I thought that was really clever. I had learned something.
What kind of advice do you have for young researchers getting started or early in their career right now?
I think a willingness to jettison things that aren't working particularly well is, just...
Amos used to say, ignore sunk costs in research.
Certainly. I mean, that's the worst. The worst thing is, but, it's hard to argue with students on that. They get a disappointing experiment, and then they spend a long time writing a discussion trying to explain it away instead of throwing that experiment out and trying a better one. And so, Amos and I had shared the same views on this, and we threw away a lot.
Do you have any insight into the sources of your success as a researcher? Any particular traits, any particular actions you took, any luck play a role? To what extent?
Well, obviously, my choice of friends is the primary. I've been extraordinarily lucky. So I had one collaboration actually with Jack Beatty, who is at UCLA, which was the first time I found the joys of collaboration. Then I had Amos Tversky, which completely changed my life. Then I had, Dick Thaler, who is my best friend and a huge influence, a mutual influence, who also changed my life. The Nobel Prize is really due to Dick Thaler's activity, at least as much as to Amos and me. And I've been lucky afterwards with people. So it's clearly something that I've been enormously lucky in the people I've worked with. In recent years, it's been David Schkadek, Sunstein. So my collaborations have been the most wonderful things in my career. It's really my research has been a social experience as well as an intellectual one, and it's been a glorious social experience.
One last question. What would you like to be remembered for? How would you like to be remembered? I never asked myself that question.
The one thing that I'm sure of is that I'll be forgotten, and that's okay. Ultimately, we're all forgotten, and that's okay. So we have a life to live, and then, there are short-term things, and you hope that people remember you fondly, but you assume they will. I have no worries on that score. And then, life will go on.
Well, thanks very much, Danny, for taking the time. It's been a pleasure.